11 light-years past the last charted beacon on the rim corridor. A Vashti cargo hauler called the Long Tide sent out a distress call and got nothing back. That was, in itself, not supposed to be possible. For 9 years, any vessel in trouble along the rim had been able to count on one thing above all others. Somewhere within a day's burn, a human interdiction ship was listening. It didn't matter whose flag you flew or what your species thought of humanity's table manners. The humans came. They always came. Captain Vay Asheltem watched the distress beacon's status light blink from amber to red over 6 hours, then 12, then a full day, and told her first mate to stop hailing the emergency channel, because there was no longer any point. "They're not coming," she said, and her first mate, young enough to have never known the rim any other way, asked the question that would, within a year, be asked in 100 different words by delegations across the entire council. Why not? They always come. Vay didn't have an answer. Nobody did yet. It would be 4 more months before the council understood that humanity hadn't simply missed one signal. Humanity had stopped listening to all of them, on purpose all at once, and that the silence on that one dead channel was the first small tremor of something far larger already moving beneath the whole of council space. Ambassador Renata Osei had given 412 speeches to the Galactic Council in 11 years, and she had learned, somewhere around speech 100, that nobody was listening to any of them. She gave the 413th anyway, because that was the job. The Chamber of Voices on Council Prime was a vast bowl of light and murmuring translation static, ringed by delegations from 61 member species, and Renata stood at the human podium, a plain stand, no ornamentation, because humans had never bothered lobbying for a nicer one, and read the Council's newest resolution into the record so that it would be official that she had objected. Resolution 8814, she said, establishes a differential tariff on services rendered by Homo sapiens contractors, citing what the resolution calls elevated behavioral volatility as a public health consideration for client species. In plain language, the Council is taxing humans for being human. A ripple of translated sound moved through the chamber, the Council's version of a shrug. The Thelex representative, a tall, patient being made of interlocking crystalline plates, inclined his head with something that might have been sympathy and might have been boredom. "Ambassador Osei," said the presiding speaker, a Dorowan elder whose four eyes tracked Renata with mild institutional interest, "your objection is noted." The resolution passed 44-9, with 8 abstentions. "It stands." "I understand that it stands," Renata said. "I want it on the record that humanity understands exactly what this resolution means, and exactly what the Council thinks of us, and that we are not confused about either." "Noted," the speaker said again, already reaching for the next item on the agenda. Renata stood at the podium a moment longer. She thought about the 11 years. She thought about the rim corridor, the 31,000 light-years of trade lanes that human convoy escorts had kept open through 3 pirate wars, while half the council debated whether humans were stable enough to be trusted with capital ships. She thought about the 22,000 human medics currently serving on mixed-species stations across council space, because humans were, for reasons nobody had ever bothered to study, the only species whose physicians could look at a Dorowan's 4 hearts, and a Thelex's crystalline nervous system, and a Vashti's asymmetrical breathing sacs in the same shift without flinching, while every other species specialized narrowly and called for a human when things got strange. She thought about the human engineers who had written the logistics architecture, the boring, invisible software that routed 90% of council cargo traffic, because humans, alone among the member species, seemed to enjoy the tedious work of making enormous systems run quietly and well. She thought about all of that and about being taxed for her volatility, and she said, "Thank you, Mr. Speaker," and walked back to her seat and did not sit down. She kept walking, out the side aisle, out the tall doors, out of the chamber of voices, and she did not stop walking until she was back aboard the human embassy shuttle, and she did not speak again to any council official for the rest of that day, or the next, or the one after that. Nobody in the chamber thought much of it. Ambassadors left early sometimes. It was only over the following weeks that the council began to notice a pattern. Ambassador Osei was not attending sessions. Her staff were not attending sessions. Human trade delegations were not answering calls. Human convoy escorts along the rim completed their current contracts and did not sign new ones. Human medical staff on mixed-species stations worked out their rotations and went home. There was no declaration, no manifesto, no ultimatum posted to the council news feeds. Humanity simply stopped answering. The way a person stops answering a caller they have decided, quietly and completely, they are finished with. It took the council 4 months to understand that humanity had left. It took the crew of the Long Tide considerably less time than that, and Ve Asheltem never did file a formal complaint, because by the time anyone at the council would have listened, the Long Tide had already been boarded twice, stripped of half its cargo, and left drifting for 11 days before a passing Thelex freighter, going well out of its way, at real risk to itself, finally towed it home. Ve told the story to anyone who would listen for the rest of her life. Almost nobody in the Chamber of Voices ever heard it. That, too, would turn out to be part of the problem. Ilvex Doranrai had been a junior attaché in the Dorwin delegation for 6 years, mostly filing reports nobody read about a species everybody had opinions on and nobody had studied. She was assigned to the Human Relations Desk, a windowless office 2 levels below the Chamber of Voices that had, until recently, been considered a punishment posting. 3 days after the council finally admitted, in a closed session, that something had gone deeply wrong. Her first task was to read 6 years of her own predecessor's reports, which she had never bothered with before, because nobody had ever bothered with them before. She began to understand, with the particular horror of someone realizing a joke had been on her the whole time, that every one of those reports had said some version of the same thing. Humans are quietly doing more of the Council's essential work than any single species realizes, because no one has ever added it up. The Rim Corridor was the first thing to go publicly wrong. 6 weeks after the last human convoy escort completed its contract, a pirate confederation that had been held at bay for a decade by human-crewed interdiction ships tested the corridor and found it open. Within 2 months, insurance rates on Rim shipping had tripled. Within 4 entire trade routes had been abandoned, and 3 border worlds that depended on Rim imports for basic medical supplies were rationing. The logistics failures were quieter but wider. Human engineers had built and maintained the routing algorithms that moved cargo through council space, a thankless, invisible job that most species considered beneath them, the way a person doesn't think about the engineers who keep a city's water pressure steady until the taps run dry. Without human maintainers, the systems didn't crash outright, they degraded slowly, the way anything does when nobody is tending it. Shipments arrived late. Warehouses filled unevenly. A produce convoy bound for the Vashti homeworld sat in a routing loop for 11 days and arrived spoiled. The medical gap was the one that made the council chamber go quiet for the first time in Ilvex's memory. A Thelex mining accident on a border station left 43 casualties with crystalline fracture wounds that none of the on-site medical staff, trained narrowly, as every species trained as doctors, in the anatomy of their own kind and perhaps 1 or 2 close neighbors, knew how to treat. The nearest human medical team was, by that point, for months gone and not coming back. 19 of the 43 died waiting for a transport crew willing to attempt cross-species trauma care they hadn't been trained for. Ilvex read the incident report 3 times before she could bring herself to file it. What stayed with her was not the casualty count, but a line from the station administrator's statement. The crystalline fracture wounds were, according to the one human doctor eventually consulted by long-range comm from a station 6 days out, textbook simple to treat, the kind of injury a first-year human medical resident would have recognized on site. Nobody else in the sector had ever been taught to look. It was the deaths, more than the trade numbers, that finally moved the council to action. Ilvex was given a task that felt, to her, both absurd and entirely deserved. Go and ask humanity to come back. The first mission was a disaster, and Ilvex watched it happen from the observation gallery, because she was too junior to be sent herself. A senior delegation, 5 species, 12 officials, considerable ceremony, traveled to Earth and requested an audience with what remained of the human diplomatic corps. They were received politely by a mid-level foreign ministry official in a plain government building in Geneva, who listened to a 40-minute prepared statement about the galaxy's need for renewed cooperation, and then said, I'll pass this along," and showed them out. There was no anger in the room. That was what unsettled the delegation most when they reported back. They had prepared for fury, for a list of grievances, for negotiation. What they got was mild, unhurried indifference, the tone of someone declining a sales call. The second mission tried a different approach, an offer of formal apology for Resolution 8814, along with proposed reparations. It was received by the same official, who thanked them for the gesture, noted that the tariff itself had already been quietly rescinded 3 weeks after humanity's departure, which the delegation had not known, and which unsettled them further. The idea that humanity had simply stopped caring whether the tax existed or not, and said that reparations were not really the point. Then what is the point? The delegation's lead asked, and the official considered the question with what looked, to the recording, like genuine thought. "I think," she said, "you'd have to ask someone who actually knows. I just filed the paperwork." Ilvex watched the recording 4 times. She began to suspect that the council had been asking the wrong question from the start. They kept asking humanity to come back to the council. Nobody had asked why humanity had wanted to be part of it in the first place. She raised this in a staff meeting and was, for the first time in 6 years, actually listened to. The meeting itself taught her something she hadn't expected. Half the senior staff in the room, she realized, genuinely believed the missions had failed because humanity was being stubborn, playing hard to get, extracting maximum leverage from a moment of unusual advantage, the way any sufficiently clever species might. It had not occurred to most of them that humanity might simply not want anything the council had thought to offer, because none of it addressed the actual wound. Ilvex tried to explain this, and watched 3 delegates nod politely without absorbing a word of it. Only the Doruan speaker, sitting at the head of the table with his 4 eyes half-lidded in the way that meant he was thinking rather than dismissing, asked her afterward, privately, to keep going. "You said something in there I want you to say again, slower," he told her. "You said we mistook their patience for weakness. I want to understand exactly what you meant, because I think I have been making that mistake for longer than you have been alive." Ilvex's next assignment was self-directed, which had never happened to her before, and she spent it doing the one thing nobody at the Human Relations desk had apparently done in 11 years. She read human history, not the council's summary files, compiled by non-human analysts working from translated fragments, and heavily weighted toward the 2 centuries of human spaceflight that intersected with council contact. She requested full archival access and read human accounts of human wars, human plagues, human famines, and the part that stopped her cold. 3 days into her research, human first contact. The council's official record of humanity's admission was brief and self-congratulatory. A young species, encountered making its first tentative steps beyond its home system, invited into galactic civilization out of council generosity, granted provisional membership, eventually granted full status after a probationary period of 40 years. The human record of the same event read entirely differently. Humans had approached first contact aware, immediately and clearly, that they were the newest and least powerful species in the room by a significant margin, outmatched in every technology that mattered, without allies, without leverage, and with a species-wide memory, still fresh, of what happened to smaller powers who negotiated from weakness with larger ones that did not particularly respect them. They joined anyway, not because they were naive about the risk, because as one human diplomat had written in a memo Ilvex found in the archive, dated to the earliest days of contact, "We have spent our whole history being cruel to each other in the dark, alone. We would rather take the risk of being disrespected by people who are, at least, not alone with us anymore." Humanity had joined the council hoping, more than anything else, to stop being alone. And for 40 years of probation and 11 years of full membership, the council had responded by treating that hope as a punchline, a species too eager, too emotional, too obviously grateful to be taken seriously, and therefore safe to underpay, underrate, and tax for the crime of feeling things visibly. Ilvex sat with that for a long time, and then went looking for the one piece of the record she suspected the council had never bothered to translate at all. Not humanity's diplomatic communications, which every species had access to, but its private ones, the internal memos, position papers, and staff cables that had passed between human officials over the 11 years of full membership, all filed correctly, all technically available, and all completely unread, because reading them had never seemed necessary when the humans kept showing up anyway. What she found there was not anger. That surprised her more than anything else in the archive. It was a long, patient, increasingly tired record of a species trying every reasonable channel available to it: formal objection, informal appeal, quiet lobbying, public statement, private correspondence, to be taken seriously as something other than useful, and watching each channel close, one by one, not through malice, but through simple inattention. A memo from Renata Osei's own predecessor, 8 years old, read, "I do not think they dislike us. I think it has simply never occurred to them that we might expect to be treated as equals, because nothing we have done has ever forced them to notice the difference." Ilvex read that line 4 times. Then she did something that was, by any reasonable definition, well outside her job description. She wrote a report that did not recommend any diplomatic strategy at all, and instead simply said in plain language what she believed to be true, that the Council had mistaken humanity's willingness to do the hard, invisible work of holding the galaxy together for a lack of pride, when it had in fact been the opposite. Humans had been trying, the whole time, to prove they belonged somewhere. And the Council's answer, delivered over and over in small ways across 11 years, had been, "You don't quite, but keep doing the paperwork." She submitted the report expecting it to vanish, the way her predecessors' reports had vanished for 6 years before her. Instead, 3 days later, she was summoned to the Chamber of Voices, not the observation gallery this time, but the floor, and told she was being sent to Earth herself. Ilvex traveled to Earth alone, without ceremony, without a delegation, and without a prepared statement, because she had come to believe, watching 2 previous missions fail, that prepared statements were themselves part of the problem. They were the Council performing diplomacy at humanity, rather than actually talking to it. She was received by the same mid-level foreign ministry official as before, a man named Adissa Osei, and Ilvex noted, with a small jolt, that the surname matched the ambassador who had walked out of the Chamber of Voices 8 months earlier. She did not ask about it directly. She had learned enough about human etiquette to know when a connection was not hers to raise. "I'm not here with an offer," Ilvex said, once they were seated. "I don't have reparations or a treaty or a formal apology written by a committee. I read your history. I think I understand a little why you left, and it isn't the tariff, and it isn't any one thing the Council did. I think it's that we never noticed you were trying, the whole time, to be noticed. And I don't know how to fix 11 years of that in one conversation. I just wanted to say it out loud to someone before I go back and tell my delegation another mission failed." Adissa was quiet for a while. Outside the window, Geneva's afternoon light moved across a lake that had existed, unbothered by galactic politics, for longer than the Council had known Earth's name. "You're the first person who's come here and not asked us for anything," he said finally. He paused, choosing the word carefully. "That's new." "I'm not authorized to ask for anything," Ilvex admitted. "I'm a junior attaché. I got sent because everyone more senior already failed." Adissa almost smiled at that. "Can I tell you something the Council's never bothered to ask in 11 years of us being members? Please." "We didn't leave because we were angry about being disrespected," he said. "Humans have been disrespected before. We're used to it, honestly, more than we'd like to be. We left because we finally understood something, and it made the disrespect unbearable in a way it hadn't been before. We understood that the Council didn't actually need to respect us to keep using us. You could tax us, mock us, outvote us on everything that mattered, and still cash in every single day on the things we built and the people we saved, because none of that required you to see us as equals. It just required us to keep showing up. And we did. For 11 years, we kept showing up, hoping that eventually the showing up would be enough to earn the respect. It wasn't. So we stopped showing up to find out whether the respect had ever actually been available at all, or whether we'd just been doing unpaid labor for people who were never going to see us as anything but useful." Ilvex had no response prepared for that, because it was true, and there was no diplomatic language that made it less true. "I don't think I can promise you the Council will change," she said eventually. I'm not senior enough to promise anything. But I can tell you that at least one person there finally understands what she's asking for when she asks you to come back. And I think that has to start somewhere before it can start everywhere. Odysseus studied her for a long moment. That's honestly the first useful thing anyone from the council has said to a human in 11 years. Ilvex's report from Geneva did not produce an immediate breakthrough. Nothing so clean as that. Diplomacy, she was learning, was mostly slow, and the parts that looked sudden from a distance were usually the visible end of months of unglamorous work that nobody outside the room ever heard about. But it did something the 2 previous missions hadn't. It changed the question the council was asking. For 11 years, the Chamber of Voices had discussed humanity in terms of usefulness, what humans contributed, what their departure cost, how quickly the gap could be filled by some combination of increased automation and reallocated labor from other species. Ilvex's report, quietly circulated and then not so quietly debated, forced a different discussion. Not what humanity did for the council, but what the council had never once done for humanity, which was take it seriously as something other than a useful problem. The debate that followed was, by council standards, unusually honest. The Thelex representative admitted that his species had voted for Resolution 8814 without seriously reading it, because human affairs were rarely considered worth close attention. A Vashti elder acknowledged that cross-species medical training had never been mandated for any species besides humans, because the assumption had always been that humans would handle the difficult cases, the way a family assumes the most capable child will handle the hard conversations, without ever thanking them for it. The Dorwin speaker, for eyes unusually still, said that the council had spent 11 years treating a founding member as a probationary one, and that this was, on reflection, difficult to defend. What the council eventually offered was not a treaty or a formal apology drafted by committee. Ilvex made sure of that, having learned from 2 failed missions what humanity did not want. Instead, they sent a delegation of exactly 1 person, the same Dorwin speaker who had told Ambassador Osei noted 8 months earlier, traveling to Earth without ceremony, without cameras, and without a prepared statement, to sit across from Renata Osei and simply listen, for the first time in 11 years, to what she actually had to say, for as long as she wanted to say it. Renata Osei did not agree to rejoin the council immediately, and the story the council eventually told about the reunion, a single, dignified meeting resolving 11 years of grievance, was, like most official stories, considerably tidier than what actually happened. What actually happened took the better part of a year, quiet conversations, a slow renegotiation of every agreement humanity had ever signed, and the detail that mattered most to Renata, though almost nobody in the council chamber understood why until Ilvex explained it to them, a standing seat for a permanent human relations desk with real authority, staffed not by whichever attaché drew the short straw, but by whoever in the council had actually bothered to understand what humanity needed. Before being told, Ilvex got the job. She had not expected it, had not asked for it, and was fairly sure she'd gotten it because she was the only person in the entire Dorwin delegation who had read 6 years of reports nobody else had touched. Humanity's formal return to the Chamber of Voices happened on a Tuesday, without particular fanfare, 18 months after Renata Osei had walked out of it. Renata stood again at the plain human podium, the same podium deliberately unchanged because she had asked that it stay exactly as it was, a reminder rather than a fresh start, and the chamber, for the first time in her 11 years of speeches, was completely silent before she even began, the translation static stilled, 61 delegations actually listening. I'm not going to pretend the last 18 months erased 11 years, she said. They didn't. But I've come to believe something I didn't believe when I walked out of this room, that this council is capable of actually hearing us when it decides to try. We're not back because we need the council. We managed fine without it, and I want that understood clearly, for the record, this time. We're back because for the first time since we joined, someone here finally asked what we needed instead of what we could be used for. That's a small thing. It shouldn't have taken this long. But it's not nothing, and we intend to hold you to it. She paused, and for a moment the old habit nearly took over, the instinct to sit down quietly and let the council move on to the next agenda item, the way it always had. Instead she looked up, found Ilvex in the gallery, where a junior attaché would once have been standing unseen, and gave the smallest possible nod. "Mr. Speaker," Renata said, "I yield the floor. But I'd like it on the record, this time, that someone's actually listening." The Dorwin speaker's 4 eyes settled on her, and for once, the response that came back was not the word noted. "We are," he said. "We intend to keep at it." It was not a large sentence. It was not the kind of line that would be quoted in the histories the way Resolution 8814 or the walkout or the rim collapse would be. But Ilvex, watching from the gallery, thought it was probably the truest thing anyone in that chamber had said in 11 years, and that the galaxy, slow, enormous, easily distracted by its own comfort, had finally, narrowly, learned something it would need a great deal longer to fully understand. That the hardest tax to collect from any people, human or otherwise, is the tax of being taken for granted, and that sooner or later, everyone who tries to collect it finds the bill comes due. Outside the Chamber of Voices, the rim corridor was quietly reopening. Human convoy crews returning to routes they'd once guarded without thanks. On a dozen mixed-species stations, human medics were signing new contracts, this time with cross-species training mandated for every species, not just the one everyone had assumed would handle it alone. It would take years to undo 11 of neglect, and everyone involved understood that. But for the first time since humanity had joined the galaxy hoping not to be alone anymore, the silence in the chamber, when Renata Ose spoke, meant that people were finally listening, and that more than any treaty, was the thing that brought humanity home. 2 years later, Vay Asheltem was hauling cargo along the same stretch of the rim corridor, where the long tide had once drifted for 11 days without answer, when a human interdiction ship fell into escort formation off her port side, right on schedule, exactly where the shipping chart said it would be. She hadn't expected the sound it startled out of her, something between a laugh and a breath she'd been holding for 2 years without noticing. Her first mate, older now and considerably less inclined to ask why the humans weren't coming, raised the young pilot on the comm out of nothing more than habit, expecting the usual clipped exchange of call signs and clearances. Instead, the human voice on the other end said, "Long tide, good to see you back on this route. Heard what happened to you out here a couple years back. Should have been someone listening. Won't happen again on our watch." Vay didn't know how to answer that, so she said nothing for a moment, and the silence sat between the two ships, comfortable and unhurried, the kind of silence that no longer needed to be filled with apology or performance, only crossed together. Then she thanked him, and the two ships flew on, side by side, into the dark the rim corridor had always been, now quietly, unglamorously, guarded again, not because the galaxy had finally learned to say thank you loudly enough, but because someone somewhere in the Chamber of Voices had finally learned to listen before the silence had to teach the lesson twice. The end.